Welcome to the Cornertalk, a series on Africana studies and sports. Today we have three amazing guests who are going to talk about sports, race, and mental health. Welcome. So what do you think we need to have more research on race, sports, and mental health?
I think for me personally, I think there is a level of emotional roller coasters that student athletes go through. Whether it's the anxiety of competition, whether it's the anxiety of just being at practice, dealing with your coaches, the level of anxiety that athletes may get from dealing with students, I think in particular a football player, basketball player whose name is always in the paper, you're televised, the pressures that people deal with, those athletes deal with. And then the pressures that you put on yourself as a student athlete to perform, to want to get better, to deal with frustration, to not want to go to class but you have to go to class. There's a whole treasure trove of stuff mentally that people go through that I don't think the standard non-athlete student goes through. And don't get me wrong, I think every student has pressures, home pressures, life pressures, social pressures, but I think there's a level of magnitude that the student athlete has on top of those pressures.
And I think to add on that, right, that when you factor in the sort of anxiety and challenges that come with being a minoritized or marginalized student, based on racial identity, you add that on top of all those pressures that come with playing sports at the highest level, that certainly there's certain impacts that perhaps we don't understand well that we should be doing some research in, right? Because we need to better understand how are athletes experiencing this and how is it impacting their mental health and wellness, right? That in many ways, we talk about the fact that there's this sort of undue burden, sort of unspoken to burden, that student athletes of color have to deal with being in predominantly white spaces, right? And so what does that look like? How does that impact their possibility? That I think that's something we want to understand better, and that's why I think research is needed in the area.
Having a background in applied behavioral studies and having been on the side where I've coached athletes who have had some challenges dealing with just the day-to-day pressures of life and living in an environment where it doesn't look like the neighborhood that you came from. You don't have the familial support that you've had growing up. You look around campus and there's nobody that you can identify with unless it's one of your teammates. So you wound up in an environment where it's smaller. You're limited, and when things happen, as Ron mentioned, when something happens on television and you're in a play and you blew it, you messed up. Rondé comes back and says you don't want to go to class. Now that's an issue that moves beyond just the moment. The student is dealing with this moving forward, and his teammates, his classmates. I've had faculty who have made comments about student athletes that have really set them back in terms of them trying to heal and get beyond it. So,
and really depending on the sport, if we look at, again, pick basketball or pick football, not only you're dealing with the local stuff, now you're talking about ESPN, you're talking about, all these other medias and platforms that have scrutinized you.
Oh yeah.
Or even publicize your social issues, your family issues. I remember Pitt was playing UConn, and the one basketball player was Muslim. And the Pitt athletes, not Pitt students during the basketball game were saying some very anti-Muslim stuff.
Freeman should have let it go. Oh yeah, absolutely. It's going to go up. Elamine Down the lane, spinning against Greer, the shot, good! Elamine scored with 2 seconds to play.
Those individuals saying it don't understand it, but that takes an emotional and mental toll on how you even just go around doing life.
I mean, one sort of practical way to think about it is, for a lot of our student athletes, particularly again at this level, they're usually the best at their high school, right? And so they're used to being treated a certain kind of way. They're used to being the star. They're used to being, the number one person. And what ends up happening is you have a lot of folks coming. In some cases, you might not see the playing field your first couple years, if at all, right? That actually takes an impact on you, right? Because going from, being celebrated and engaged, in your particular sport to perhaps not even seeing the playing field, right? There's an impact there, right? And again, when you factor in all the other things that you have to account for, now you're in an academic institution where there's expectations, where perhaps, maybe in high school it might have been a bit lax, but folks are a bit more stringent now, right? These are things, again, that often go unspoken, that have a significant toll, and to Dr. Brown's point, for a number of student athletes, they might not think of that as, I'm being impacted. They just think, oh, this is rough, this is normal, but they internalize it, right? And it reshapes their trajectories. And without the ability to really understand how it's sort of impacting them emotionally, mentally, their wellness, right, that it's hard to understand what sort of interventions or opportunities can be uplifted to make sure that they are processing it in the best way possible.
Depression is real. Mm-hmm. Depression. I think that's probably the main thing in my experience, just being around athletes, period, as in college. Like, not playing or the injuries. Mm-hmm. Those injuries, like, they take people out.
Concussions are huge. The experience that a student athlete goes through. You have a concussion. The first thing they do is tell you, don't go to class, keep the computer turned off, stay away from the TV, lights, and oh, by the way, you got an exam tomorrow. You got an assignment you need to get turned in. You're behind on the research that you were supposed to do to get this project ready. And by the way, you got to come over here and go through this rehab. And that takes precedence and priority over what you're dealing with regard to your health. Never mind the fact that now I can't play.
Yeah.
And that's what I came here for. So it's huge.
Also, as an educator, I'm mindful of the fact that, a number of our athletes sometimes think they have to play into a stereotype, that they have to be the jock, right? That they have to be the goofy one, right? Because in many ways, that's what they've known. And so there's
unexpected.
Yes, right. And so I think part of what has to happen, again, for all student athletes, but particularly student athletes of color, is to be mindful that you're more than an athlete, right? And that you have all sorts of possibilities, and you have to invest in yourself, right? You have to think about what your purpose is beyond the playing field, beyond the playing arena, right? Because if all or if all you're focused on is that playing field, the playing arena, and again, the vast majority of people will not go pro. Right, and if you haven't prepared to say, okay, what is my life beyond sports, right, that you're going to find yourself hard pressed to really figure out how to make the best use of your time. I guess part of my message is, to be mindful of some challenges that aren't always articulated, when it comes to the experience, particularly as a black athlete. I can recall during my time, there were certain things that I would notice that I didn't have the words for at the time, where people might share things that weren't accurate about you, or people might make suggestions about you, particularly in an environment where, for me, coming from a place like the Bronx, New York, where I was surrounded by folks of color and coming into a space that's predominantly white, that I noticed that people approached me and engaged me differently. I encourage all athletes in particular to really do the personal work, right? To invest in yourself, to take time to reflect on who you are, who you want to be, right? Be mindful that you might sometimes see or hear messaging that isn't accurate, that might try to portray you differently in a negative light, right? But not to, overcome or be overwhelmed by that. And certainly easier said than done, but leverage resources around you, whether it's your peers, whether it's other faculty, in particular departments, to have those conversations, to reflect on your identity, to understand how society might be shaped in ways that might not necessarily put you in a position for success, but to be mindful that you can overcome those things.